Please, sir. My mother's hungry." 5 words, barely a whisper, from a woman who could hardly stand, and the most feared man in Baltimore would never be the same. Bernice Wade was 27, though the exhaustion carved into her face made her look older. Her waitress uniform still creased from a shift she'd never been paid for. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving every dollar for her dying mother's medicine, and now the bouncers were shoving her out of the very club she'd worked in every night, because Vernon Kish had fired her the evening before. And men like Kish didn't hand out second chances. Her legs gave out, she stumbled forward, and her frail body collided with a wall of a man stepping down from a black Maybach. Darius Halewood. 37. A name spoken only in hushed voices across the city's underworld. He was tall, carved from something colder than stone, his tailored charcoal coat sharp against the gray dawn, his eyes the shade of a storm that had forgotten how to break. 4 years ago he'd buried his wife and the child she carried, and something inside him had died with them. They said Darius Halewood didn't feel anything at all anymore. So when this trembling stranger fell against his chest and breathed those 5 simple words, he did what he always did. He pushed her away, cold and silent, and turned to leave. She didn't beg, she didn't chase him, she didn't reach out for pity. She simply straightened what little was left of her dignity and staggered off into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the echo of a truth that asked for nothing, and that was what cracked him. Because Darius had heard 1,000 pleas in his life, every one of them calculated, every one of them designed to move him. But hers hadn't asked for money, it hadn't promised gratitude, it had simply stated a fact and walked away, and for the first time in 4 years, the most ruthless man in Baltimore couldn't move. He stood frozen in the cold, watching that fragile figure disappear down a broken street, and against every instinct that had kept him alive in a world of blood and betrayal, he made a decision that would unravel everything. He followed her. What he discovered behind that shattered apartment window would shake the very foundations of his empire, because this starving waitress was holding a secret that could burn his whole world to the ground and unmake the man he'd become. If this story already has you holding your breath, do this old storyteller a small favor, tap that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who believes dignity still means something in this world, and subscribe to the channel because you won't want to miss where this goes. Now, let's step back into the mist and follow the man who thought he'd lost his heart forever, and the woman who was about to hand it back to him. The Maybach rolled slowly along, keeping just enough distance from her small figure not to be noticed, while Darius Halewood sat behind the wheel, his gray eyes never leaving the woman staggering down the street ahead of him. He didn't understand why he was doing this. In more than 20 years of living in a world where every movement had to be calculated and every decision had to yield a profit, a senseless act like following a starving waitress was something he had never allowed himself to do. And yet now, his gloved fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel, and he continued after her, silent as a shadow. Bernice turned away from the broad avenue, where the glass towers still glimmered faintly with the first lights of morning, crossing an invisible boundary that the entire city knew was there but no one ever named aloud. Behind her lay downtown, with its polished storefronts, its cafes beginning to open, and the scent of toasted bread drifting through the cold air. Ahead of her, East Baltimore emerged like an old wound that had never healed. Rows of red brick houses built in the previous century stood with their windows boarded shut, their walls mottled with spray paint, and their front steps cracked apart where weeds pushed through the seams in the concrete. A few old cars sat rusting along the curb, their windows shattered and their tires flat, like the skeletons of a prosperous age that had died long ago. Darius let the car crawl through those streets, and for the first time in years, he truly looked. He owned half this city. His name appeared on the deeds to buildings he had never entered, on parcels of land he bought and sold like pieces on a game board. But he had never seen them this way. He had never seen a real human being walking through them on legs trembling from hunger. His charcoal gray wool coat, tailored by a shop in London, and worth enough to feed an entire family down here for 6 months, suddenly felt unbearably heavy across his shoulders. Bernice stopped in front of a small grocery store and hesitated as she stared through the window at several loaves of bread and cartons of milk. Then she reached toward her coat pocket, froze, and kept walking. Darius saw everything. He saw the way she swallowed something lodged in her throat, the way she lifted her head even as her entire body seemed ready to collapse, the way she refused to let herself stop for too long because she was afraid that, once she did, she wouldn't be able to rise again. Something stirred inside his chest, something he had believed he'd buried with his wife beneath a stone marker 4 years earlier. He frowned, irritated by the unfamiliar feeling, and nearly turned the car around. But he didn't. She slipped into a narrow alley between 2 rows of buildings, a place where the morning light could barely reach, and Darius stopped the car at the entrance. He knew he couldn't drive in without drawing attention. For a moment, the cold reason that had always governed his life spoke up, reminding him who he was, reminding him that dozens of people were waiting for him at the office, reminding him that some unknown woman had nothing to do with the empire he had shed blood to build. He should leave. He always left. But he shut off the engine, pulled his collar up to cover half his face, and stepped out of the car. The bitter January wind struck him across the face, carrying the smell of damp decay, uncollected garbage, and the kind of poverty his money had never forced him to breathe. He walked into the alley, his polished leather shoes stepping through stagnant puddles and shards of broken glass, each stride taking him farther from the world he knew, and deeper into a place where his power seemed to dissolve. Bernice had disappeared at the far end of the alley, where a rusted iron staircase climbed toward the upper floor of a building that looked ready to collapse. Darius stopped in the darkness, pressing his back against the freezing brick wall, and wondered for the 10th time what the hell he was doing there. The man whose name made all of Baltimore lower its voice, the man who had never allowed emotion to influence a single decision, was now hiding in a foul-smelling alley, watching a waitress whose full name he didn't even know. He thought of the 5 words she had whispered against his chest, of the way they had asked for nothing, bargained for nothing, performed no deception, but had simply offered a truth and left it behind. In all those years, no one had ever said anything to him without concealing a hook beneath the words. She was the first, and that was precisely why he couldn't turn away. He heard a door open somewhere above, its hinges crying out in pain, followed by the sound of her weakened footsteps, mingling with another noise coming from inside the room, a sound that made his entire body go still. It was the sound of a machine, steady and hoarse, like an artificial breath struggling to keep someone tethered to this world. Darius lifted his gaze toward the clouded window above, where a sickly yellow light cast a dim shadow, and he knew that no matter what happened next, he wouldn't leave that alley until he understood what he had just witnessed. Darius climbed several steps of the iron staircase, close enough for his eyes to be level with the window, where one corner of the glass had shattered and been temporarily covered with cardboard and strips of tape, whose edges had begun to peel away. Through that narrow opening, he saw the room inside, and for the second time that morning, his entire body seemed to turn to stone. The room was so small there was barely enough space to move, its walls peeling away in patches, while a bare bulb swayed from the ceiling and cast a sickly yellow light over the bed pressed against the far corner. Lying there was a woman of about 58, her face so gaunt that her skin seemed stretched directly across her bones, her complexion tinted with the dull yellow pallor of someone who had been ill for a very long time. Beside her stood an aging machine that Darius needed several moments to recognize as a dialysis machine, a model that had been obsolete for years, its cracked casing patched with tape, its tangled tubes connected to the sick woman's thin arm. The machine produced the same steady, rasping sound he had heard from the alley below, each beat like a silent plea sent toward death itself, begging it to wait just a little longer. Bernice knelt beside the bed, and Darius watched her place a crumpled paper bag on the small table. She opened it, revealing only a single piece of bread, something she had probably begged for, or picked up somewhere along the way home. She broke the bread in half, and he held his breath as he waited to see what she would do. She gave the larger portion to her mother and kept the smaller one in her palm, but then he saw her hesitate, look at her mother's wasted face, and quietly break her own share again, placing another half into the older woman's hand, and keeping for herself only a fragment no larger than 2 finger joints. Her mother shook her head faintly and whispered something he couldn't hear through the window, perhaps telling her daughter to eat, but Bernice only smiled, and Darius recognized that the smile was a lie, the smile of someone who had grown far too accustomed to pretending she wasn't hungry. She said she had already eaten at the restaurant, that the manager had given her the leftovers at the end of her shift, and Darius knew it wasn't true, because only a few hours earlier, he had watched her being thrown out of that very place. His gaze fell upon her hand as she raised a glass of water to her mother's lips, and something about it tightened his chest in a way he couldn't explain. They were the hands of someone who had once done something delicate, with long, graceful fingers, but now they were hardened by work, the fingertips cracked, the backs marked with countless tiny burns and cuts from years of carrying plates and serving tables. Those hands trembled with exhaustion, yet they remained astonishingly gentle as she lifted her mother's head, brushed the strands of silver hair stuck to the woman's damp forehead, and pulled the thin, fraying blanket higher across her chest to keep her warm. She did all of it without a single complaint, without shedding one tear, as though a person drained so completely that she was nearly collapsing could still pour out the last of her strength to care for someone else. Darius Halewood had witnessed many things in his life. He had seen people betray one another for money, seen the strong crush the weak beneath their feet, seen blood spilled and tears shed for reasons so petty they became cruel. He had sealed his heart shut with his own hands 4 years earlier, when he lowered the coffin carrying his pregnant wife into the earth, and from that day forward he had lived like a flawless machine, without emotion, without weakness, beyond the reach of anything that might touch him. Yet now, standing in the cold darkness of that alley with his eyes fixed on the broken window, he felt the armor he had spent 4 years forging begin to crack. It wasn't because the young woman was crying, but because she wasn't crying at all. It was because she gave away her final mouthful without hesitation. It was because inside the most wretched room he had ever seen, surrounded by the smell of medicine and damp decay, she still possessed something all his wealth could never buy, a quiet dignity so profound that it made the most powerful man in Baltimore lower his head. He saw the final crumb of bread resting in her palm, and he watched her close her fingers tightly around it, not eating it, but slipping it into her coat pocket, saving it for later, or perhaps saving it for the next time her mother woke and was still hungry. At that moment, the woman in the bed began to cough, a dry, brutal cough that seemed to drain the last breath from her lungs, and Bernice quickly bent down to support her. For a fleeting second, a naked terror crossed her face before she could hide it, the terror of someone who knew she was racing against time, and knew she was losing. Darius stepped back from the window, his heart beating in a strange and unfamiliar rhythm, and he realized he couldn't simply stand there watching and then walk away as though he had seen nothing. But he couldn't knock on the door yet either. Not now. He needed to know who she was. He needed to understand why fate had driven a person like her all the way down into the deepest mud. And so he quietly withdrew into the darkness, carrying inside his chest a fracture he knew would never heal the way it had before. Back inside the Maybach, Darius sat motionless for a long while before starting the engine, his gray eyes still fixed on the clouded window, where the sickly yellow light continued to glow. He took out his phone and called Fenwick Doyle, the loyal right-hand man who had served beside him for nearly 10 years, and his voice sounded dry and rough as he asked for something that felt strange even to him. He gave Fen the address of the building and the street number, then told him to find everything he could about the woman who lived there, about the apartment, about who owned it, who collected the rent, and anything else that could be uncovered. Fen didn't ask why, because in their world, people learned that unnecessary questions were often paid for in blood, but Darius heard the faint hesitation in the other man's voice, a carefully hidden surprise that the coldest man in Baltimore had taken an interest in a crumbling address on the east side. 2 hours later, after Darius had returned to the penthouse on the highest floor of the building that bore his name, where the entire city spread beneath him like a map of power, Fen called back, and what he said made the glass of liquor in Darius's hand stop halfway to his lips. The young woman's name was Bernice Wade, 27 years old, and she lived with her mother, Beatrix Wade, 58, who was in the final stage of kidney disease and required regular dialysis. Up to that point, everything matched what had seen with his own eyes. But then Fen lowered his voice, and what came next seemed to freeze the air inside the room. That apartment, along with the entire row of buildings surrounding it, was listed among properties facing foreclosure, and the name behind the debt didn't belong to a bank or any legitimate lending company. It belonged to Thaddeus Orlowski, Darius set the glass down on the marble table, his fingers tightening into a fist. Of all the names Fen could have spoken, that was the one Darius hated most. The name bound to the darkest 4 years of his life. The rival who had fought him for every inch of territory for nearly a decade. The man whose very mention awakened a slow, burning rage inside him that had never truly faded. Orlowski had been quietly taking control of East Baltimore, buying up bad debts, forcing the poorest families into desperation so he could swallow entire streets, one by one, and turn them into a backyard for operations that even Darius found repulsive. And now, with an irony so sharp it was almost impossible to believe, the girl who had whispered 5 words against his chest that morning, the girl he had silently followed to the lowest depths of the city, the girl whose quiet dignity had cracked the armor he had worn for 4 years, was the debtor of the enemy he despised more than anyone alive. Fen added that the Wade family's debt was unusually large for an apartment in such miserable condition, so large that it made no sense, and that Orlowski appeared to be paying particular attention to that address, sending men to watch it far more often than any of the others on the list. Darius remained silent as questions without answers began spinning through his mind. Why would a family made up of only 2 women, one older and gravely ill, the other young and nearly collapsing from hunger, owe Orlowski such an enormous amount of money? Why would Orlowski, a man who had never cared about insignificant debtors, unless there was something valuable hidden behind them, personally keep such close watch over that decaying address as though it concealed something precious? Darius stepped out onto the balcony, and the cold wind high above the city struck him across the face. Somewhere below, in a dark corner of Baltimore, the sickly yellow light in Bernice's room was still burning, as fragile as the life of the mother fading beside the dialysis machine. He had intended to help the girl quietly and then withdraw, to treat it as repayment for the strange moment she had awakened inside him, to call it a rare act of impulse and then forget it. But that was no longer possible. She wasn't merely a starving waitress who had happened to stumble into his life. She was a thread, and the other end of that thread was tied directly around the wrist of the enemy he had sworn he would one day destroy. Anything he did for her from that moment forward would pull him into a game whose rules he didn't yet understand. A game Orlowski had been arranging in silence for reasons Darius still couldn't guess. He should stay away, his cold reason warned him again. Stay away from the girl. Stay away from that address. Stay away from everything connected to Orlowski, until he knew exactly what kind of trap he was walking into. But when he thought of those calloused hands lifting a glass of water to her mother's lips, of that final crumb of bread hidden away instead of eaten, Darius knew that this time, for the first time in many years, he wouldn't listen to reason. For the next 3 days Darius did nothing, or at least that was what he told himself. He buried himself in work, in private meetings held in the back rooms of restaurants, in numbers and agreements that demanded his absolute coldness. But the image of those calloused hands and that tiny crumb of bread kept returning to his mind, persistent as a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin that he couldn't pull free. He didn't understand why. He had turned away hundreds of suffering people in his life, had walked past them without blinking, had taught himself that pity was a luxury no man in his world could afford to carry. Yet this time, that strange instinct refused to release him. On the 4th day, Darius called someone he rarely contacted directly, Dr. Margot Price, a kidney specialist at the largest hospital in the city, a woman whose community clinic he had quietly funded many years earlier, without allowing his name to appear anywhere. He didn't offer much explanation. He simply gave her the name Beatrix Wade, the address of the apartment on the east side, and instructed her to arrange for the woman to receive proper treatment, dialysis on certified equipment, complete examinations, and all necessary medication, with every expense paid through a fund that could never be traced back to him. Margot fell silent for a moment on the other end of the line, then asked him why, and Darius replied in a dry voice that it wasn't something she needed to know, that she only had to make certain the patient never learned where the money came from, that his name was never to be mentioned under any circumstances, not even once. He told himself that this was merely a small investment, a way to keep Orlowski's debtor alive long enough for him to understand what his enemy was planning, a cold and calculated move rather than an act of kindness, and he almost believed it, almost. But he knew that treating the mother wouldn't be enough, because the daughter would continue draining herself dry, continue going hungry to save every cent, continue slowly dying inside the endless cycle of poverty unless someone gave her a way out. And so Darius did a second thing, something he would later recognize as the turning point that pulled them both into each other's orbit. He owned a jazz club called the Halcyon, a place entirely unlike the noisy nightclubs where Bernice had once worked, an elegant and discreet refuge with high ceilings, warm lighting, velvet chairs, and a small stage where musicians played old jazz standards every night. In one corner of that stage stood a glossy black piano, an instrument Darius had brought there many years earlier, and then left almost completely untouched. He called the manager of the Halcyon and ordered him to expect a woman named Bernice Wade to apply for a position within the next few days. She was to be hired to handle the books and serve the section reserved for regular patrons, at a salary far higher than usual, and no one was permitted to reveal that Darius himself was behind it. The manager didn't dare question him. Then Darius arranged for news of the opening to reach Bernice in the most natural way possible, through a flyer posted on the very street she often walked, through a chance remark from an old acquaintance, every detail carefully staged so she would believe this was an opportunity she had found for herself, rather than something another person had handed to her. He did all of it from the shadows, never appearing once, never leaving a word behind, and he told himself it was because he needed to maintain his distance, because a man like him couldn't allow himself to become publicly involved with one of Orlowski's debtors. But beneath all those cold explanations lay a truth Darius still didn't dare name. He didn't want her looking at him with the grateful eyes of someone who had been granted mercy. He didn't want to turn the pure moment she had awakened inside him into an ordinary debt of gratitude. That night, standing alone on the balcony of his penthouse with a glass of liquor in his hand, Darius looked down at the city and wondered what kind of game he was playing, and what tenderness could possibly remain in a man who had buried his heart with his wife and unborn child 4 years earlier. He had no answer. He only knew that the following morning, when Fenn reported that Bernice Wade had applied for the position at the Halcyon and had been hired, something inside his chest stirred softly, something warm and dangerous that he had believed himself forever incapable of feeling again. Bernice had been working at the Halcyon for exactly 1 week when things began to stop fitting the logic she had known all her life. She understood the value of every dollar, understood that nothing in this world was ever truly free, and that was precisely why she noticed at once that something was wrong. The salary she received was twice what a bookkeeper who also waited tables should have been paid. Her shifts were always arranged perfectly, so she had enough time to return home and care for her mother. And strangest of all, when she visited Beatrix at the hospital, the doctors told her that every treatment expense had been covered by a charitable fund, that her mother had been transferred to a new dialysis machine, and placed on a treatment plan Bernice knew her family could never have afforded. No one could explain what the fund was, where it had come from, or who had created it. Bernice wasn't foolish enough to believe in miracles. She began paying attention, and she noticed that the manager of the Halcyon sometimes looked at her with a guarded expression, as though she belonged to someone higher above him, as though an invisible hand were protecting her without her even knowing it. She pressed him for answers, but he only avoided her questions, and that made the fire of suspicion inside her burn even hotter. Then, late one night, after most of the guests had left, and she was cleaning the bar, the door to the private room upstairs opened, and for the first time since that fateful morning, she saw the man who had shoved her out through the nightclub entrance. She recognized him immediately, that tall, powerful frame, that dark coat, those gray eyes as cold as stone, and for one suspended moment the entire room seemed to stop breathing. But instead of lowering her head, instead of stammering out her gratitude, Bernice slammed the cleaning cloth onto the bar, walked straight toward him with fire blazing in her eyes, and spoke in a voice that trembled more from anger than fear. She asked whether it had been him, whether he was the one behind all of it, the absurdly well-paid job, the mysterious charity fund covering her mother's hospital bills, the shifts arranged so carefully that they could only have been intentional. Darius stood still on the staircase and didn't deny it, and his silence was answer enough. Bernice laughed, a bitter, wounded sound, and said she had already guessed, that men like him never did anything without a purpose, and then she asked him directly what he wanted from her in exchange for everything he had given. Darius descended several steps, his voice deep and cold as he told her he wanted nothing. But Bernice didn't believe him, and she finally spoke the words she had carried inside herself all week. She told him she didn't need his pity, that would rather go hungry and keep her self-respect than fill her stomach with charity, that she had spent her entire life in poverty, but had never once held out her hand to ask for anything she hadn't earned. She said that on the morning she had collided with him, she hadn't asked him for money, she had only spoken a truth and walked away, and she couldn't understand why a man who had coldly pushed her aside like a piece of trash was now secretly weaving a net around her life. She asked whether this was some kind of game to him, whether a powerful man like him found pleasure in buying a poor little waitress and turning her into a puppet whose strings he could pull. Every word she spoke cut like a knife, and Darius, the man whose name made all of Baltimore lower its voice, the man who had never allowed anyone to challenge without paying a price, stood there and endured every one of them because he realized no one in all those years had ever dared look him directly in the eyes and speak with such honesty. In her blazing gaze, he saw the same dignity that had cracked something open inside him through that broken window. Only now it was no longer quiet but burning fiercely, and it made him both angry and drawn to her in a way he didn't want to admit. He told her, in a softer voice that was no less firm, that if she wanted to leave the job, the door was still there, that he had never forced anyone to stay, but that her mother would continue receiving treatment whether Bernice remained or not, because he hadn't done any of it to buy her. Bernice faltered, because those weren't the words of a man trying to bargain. She looked at him for a long time, searching those gray eyes for some sign of deception, some trap, some hidden calculation, but all she found was something dark and weary, a loneliness so deep that her anger began to weaken even though she didn't want it to. She didn't thank him, she couldn't yet, but she didn't leave either, and the two of them stood there beneath the warm yellow lights of the empty club, with a strange tension between them that felt partly like hostility and partly like something else. Neither of them was ready to name. Bernice decided to stay, not because she trusted Darius, but because she was practical enough to know that leaving now would be a form of suicide, and because some part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed, needed to understand who that strange man truly was. In the weeks that followed, as she worked at the Halcyon, she began observing his world from the inside, and what she saw made her both cautious and curious. The club wasn't simply a place where people came to listen to music. During the day, it was quiet and elegant, but at night, beyond the familiar patrons, there were faces she gradually realized didn't belong to the ordinary world. Men in expensive suits entered through the back door and were escorted directly to the private room upstairs, where no one else was allowed to go, and there they sat with Darius for hours behind closed doors. Thick envelopes changed hands discreetly. Whispered phone calls stopped the moment she approached, and sudden silences settled over the room whenever his name was spoken in tones that carried equal measures of respect and fear. Bernice wasn't naive. She had grown up in East Baltimore. She knew the scent of the underworld when it was close, and she understood that the man who had saved her mother wasn't an honest businessman. What confused her was the way everything here operated, not through chaos and naked violence like the old nightclub where the guards had once thrown her out, but through a cold, precise order that was almost elegant, a world where a single nod from Darius carried more weight than any shouted command. The man who was always at his side was Fenwick Doyle, whom everyone simply called Fen, a man of about 40 with a calm demeanor, eyes as sharp as knives, and a way of speaking that was unexpectedly courteous. Bernice noticed that Fen was the only person Darius truly listened to, the only one who dared speak plainly to him without fear, and through a few brief conversations, she learned that Fen had once served as a military medic before entering this world, which explained his strange calm in the face of things that would have made an ordinary person recoil. It was Fen who, one night, quietly brought her a cup of hot tea when he saw her shivering behind the bar and told her in a voice that was half warning and half kindness that she should be careful, that this world wasn't meant for people who still had good hearts, and that his boss wasn't as easy to understand as she seemed to think. Bernice asked him what kind of man Darius Halewood really was, and Fen remained silent for a long moment before answering that some men, became cruel because they had been born wicked, while others became cruel because life had taken away everything that had once made them want to be kind. And Darius belonged to the second kind. Those words haunted her for days. She began noticing the small details she had overlooked before, the way Darius never smiled, the way his eyes drifted far away whenever the band played a sorrowful melody, the way he always sat alone in the darkest corner of the room, as though he had imprisoned himself inside an invisible cell. She watched the most powerful men in the city lower themselves before him, saw even impeccably dressed officials soften their voices when they stood in his presence. She understood that she was working for one of the most feared men in Baltimore. That should have made her run. Yet paradoxically, the more she watched him, the more Bernice realized that beneath that frozen exterior was a man who was utterly alone, a man who had built an entire empire and still had no one to return to. And instead of frightening her, that knowledge awakened something dangerous inside her that she tried to push away, a sympathy she knew she shouldn't feel. She reminded herself that this man belonged to a world filled with blood and darkness, that the kindness he had shown her might be only the visible edge of something whose depths she couldn't see, and that the more she allowed herself to be drawn into his orbit, the more she endangered both herself and her mother, in ways she couldn't yet understand. But every night, when she left the Halcyon and stepped into the cold street, she found herself looking back at the lit window where he was still sitting alone, and she hated herself for it. One night, after the club had closed and the last employees had gone home, Bernice stayed later than usual, alone in the dim space where only the light spilling from the bar remained. The black piano in the corner of the stage, the one she had always watched in silence but had never dared touch, seemed to call to her that night with a pull she couldn't resist. She sat down before the keys, and for a moment, her old life came rushing back. Before poverty swallowed her family whole, before her mother fell ill, and she had to abandon everything to work as a waitress, Bernice had once been a music student, had once possessed fingers that moved across piano keys, instead of carrying trays and wiping tables. She placed her hands on the keyboard, and the first notes emerged hesitantly, then gradually grew steadier as the memory sleeping within her calloused fingers awakened. She played a sorrowful, gentle piece, an old composition she had loved since she was a young girl, and in the silence of the Halcyon, the music sounded like the voice of a soul finally allowed to speak after years of being mute. She had no idea that Darius was still upstairs in his private room. He heard the piano, and in the first instant, his entire body went rigid, as though an invisible hand had closed around his throat. Because it was that very piece, the melody Colette, his late wife, had played again and again during those peaceful afternoons now lost forever, the piece he had forbidden anyone to touch for 4 years. The true reason the piano had been brought there, and then left to gather dust. Darius descended the stairs slowly, each step drawn forward by the music, and he stopped at the bottom, standing motionless in the shadows as he watched the woman bowed over the keys, her hair slipping loose from its knot, her face beneath the dim light carrying a beauty made deeper by sorrow. When the final note rang out and slowly faded into the room, Bernice looked up and startled at the sight of him standing there. She rose quickly and began stammering an apology for taking such a liberty. But Darius only shook his head faintly, and when he spoke, his voice was so rough he barely recognized it himself. He asked where she had learned that piece, and Bernice was taken aback by the change in him, by the way the layer of ice that always surrounded him had suddenly cracked open to reveal something wounded beneath. She answered that it had been her favorite composition since her school days, that she had once dreamed of becoming a pianist before life had taken her somewhere else. Darius remained silent for a very long time, and then he did something he hadn't done with anyone in 4 years. He stepped closer, rested his hand on the piano lid, and in a voice so quiet that she could barely hear him, told her that his wife had once played that piece too. Bernice froze, because she had never heard anyone speak about his wife, only vague rumors of a loss that had turned him into the man he was now. Darius said her name, Colette, and it left his lips like a wound that had never closed. He told Bernice, not much, only a few brief sentences heavy with grief, that Colette had died 4 years earlier while carrying their child, that he hadn't been able to do anything to save her, and that from that day on, he had told himself he no longer had the right to feel anything at all. He stopped, as though even he were surprised by how much he had revealed. And in those gray eyes that were usually cold as stone, Bernice saw a real human being for the first time, a man carrying a sorrow that power and wealth could never ease. She didn't offer empty words of comfort, because she understood better than anyone that some wounds couldn't be reached by words. She only said softly that she was sorry, and that she understood what it felt like to lose someone you would give everything to keep, because every day she was watching her own mother slip farther beyond her reach. In that moment, within the silence of the empty club, two people from worlds that couldn't have been farther apart suddenly recognized one another, not as a kingpin and a waitress, but as two souls carrying the same kinds of fractures. Neither moved any closer, and neither touched the other, because both of them knew that the distance between them was the only thing still keeping them safe. But when Darius turned away and climbed the stairs, leaving her alone beside the piano, with the fading music still hanging in the air, they both understood that something had changed forever, that a door had opened between them, and neither of them knew how to close it again. That fragile peace didn't last long. Only a few days after the night at the piano, Fen entered Darius's private room with a tension on his face that he rarely allowed anyone to see, and placed a stack of freshly printed photographs on the table, the paper still warm. They had been taken from a distance and showed an unfamiliar car parked for hours outside the alley leading to the Wade family's apartment, with men sitting inside holding binoculars and cameras, patiently watching everyone who came and went. Fen said in a low voice that Orlowski's people had caught the scent of something. Beatrix's medical bills had suddenly been paid. Bernice had found a new job with an unusually generous salary, and all the abrupt changes in the lives of a family that should have been left to collapse and die had drawn the enemy's attention. Orlowski was suspicious and ruthless. He didn't believe in luck, and when he saw a debtor he had been squeezing suddenly receive protection from someone, he immediately wanted to know whose invisible hand was behind it. Darius stared at the photographs, his jaw clenched, and Fen said aloud what both of them had already understood. If Orlowski discovered that Darius Halewood was the one standing behind them, then the girl and her sick mother would no longer be insignificant debtors. They would become pieces on the board, leverage, a weakness the enemy could use to strike at him. In their world, people didn't attack a powerful man like Darius directly. They attacked whatever he cared about, and Orlowski was a master of that game. Fen spoke plainly, more like a friend than a subordinate, saying that he hadn't seen Darius care about anyone since Colette died, and that this concern, whatever it was becoming a deadly vulnerability. He asked Darius whether it was worth it, whether a waitress he had known for only a few weeks was worth placing both his empire and her life in danger. Darius didn't answer at once. He walked to the window and looked down at the city at night, and inside him rose a sensation he knew all too well, the instinct of an animal that knew a predator was drawing near. He knew Fen was right. He knew that every day Bernice remained in his orbit was another day she moved closer to the line between life and death. But he knew something else too. Something he hadn't yet spoken aloud, that if he withdrew now, if he abandoned the Wade family to be torn apart by Orlowski, then whatever had come back to life inside him, after 4 years of numbness, would die again, and this time it would be forever. He asked Fen how much Orlowski knew, and Fen replied that fortunately, he still hadn't traced the money, because Darius had hidden the trail too carefully, but it was only a matter of time. What worried Fen wasn't the fact that Orlowski was watching them, but the unusual patience with which he was doing it, as though he wasn't merely trying to collect a debt, but waiting for something, guarding that apartment as if it were a treasure vault. Fen said there was something wrong with the entire situation, that an ordinary debt wouldn't make a man like Orlowski assign people to watch a place day and night for months, and that he had a feeling the Wade family possessed something they themselves didn't know about, something Orlowski wanted badly enough to wait for. Darius turned to look at Fen, and inside his mind, the scattered pieces began to shift, though they still hadn't formed a complete picture. He ordered Fen to increase the protection around Bernice and Beatrix, but to do it discreetly, without exposing anything, while also digging deeper into the real reason behind Orlowski's obsession with that address. Fen nodded, but before leaving, he stopped at the door and added something that sent a chill down Darius's spine. He said that the previous night, One of their guards had reported seeing someone slip into the Wade family's building, while both mother and daughter were away, search through the apartment, and disappear without taking anything valuable. It hadn't been an ordinary thief, because the money and the few possessions they owned had been left untouched. The intruder had been looking for something else. And whatever it was, he still hadn't found it. Darius stood motionless in the center of the room, and for the first time, he understood clearly that he and the girl had been drawn into a conspiracy far greater than anything he had imagined. A conspiracy in which death might be waiting around any corner. The news that the apartment had been searched left Bernice terrified, and that evening, when she returned home, she told her mother what had happened in a trembling voice, hoping Beatrix would reassure her that it had only been some petty thief. But her mother's reaction made her go still. The frail woman suddenly turned visibly pale, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket, and a fear rose in her eyes unlike anything Bernice had ever seen. Not the fear of a sick person facing death, but the fear of someone who had hidden something for far too many years and knew it had finally caught up with her. Beatrix told her daughter to sit beside the bed, and in a weak, broken voice interrupted by exhaustion, she began revealing the truth she had buried since Bernice's childhood. She said that Bernice's father, the man Bernice remembered only through a few blurred fragments of childhood, hadn't died in an accident as Beatrix had always claimed. Bernice stared at her in shock, because all her life she had believed her father had been killed in a car accident when she was about 10 years old, a shadowy loss her mother had never wanted to discuss. Beatrix closed her eyes as tears ran down her hollow cheeks, and then she spoke the terrible truth. Bernice's father had been an accountant, a man gifted with numbers, and many years earlier, when the family had fallen into desperate financial hardship, he had accepted work for an organization whose true nature he didn't fully understand, an organization led by a man named Thaddeus Orlowski. His job had been to clean dirty money, to turn profits from crime into legitimate figures on paper, and for years he had done it, closing his eyes to where the money came from, so he could provide for his wife and child. But Bernice's father hadn't been an evil man. He had only been a weak man driven into a corner by circumstance, and one day, when he realized that the organization wasn't merely laundering money, but was involved in crimes far more horrifying, his conscience wouldn't allow him to continue. He had secretly copied everything, every transaction, every name, every piece of evidence proving what Orlowski had done throughout all those years, gathering it in a secure place with the intention of someday using it to free himself and his family from the claws of that wicked man. Beatrix said he had tried to escape, planning to take his wife and daughter away from the city, but Orlowski had sensed the betrayal. One rainy night, men came looking for him, and he never returned. She explained that they were told he had died in an accident, that his body had been found beneath a river, but she knew it hadn't been an accident. She knew Orlowski had ordered her husband killed to silence him. Bernice sat without moving, her entire world spinning, everything she had believed about her family for nearly 20 years collapsing in only a few minutes. But Beatrix hadn't finished. She took her daughter's hand, her thin fingers gripping so tightly that Bernice felt pain, and confessed the final truth, the one that explained everything. Orlowski had never found the evidence her husband had hidden. For all these years, he had hunted for it without stopping, because whatever it contained was powerful enough to destroy him completely. The so-called debt he used to tighten his grip around the Wade family, the reason he sent men to watch them and search their apartment, had never truly been about money. It was only a pretext, a way to keep Beatrix and Bernice under his control, so he could continue searching for what he believed was still hidden somewhere, the thing Beatrix's husband had died protecting. Beatrix said she didn't know where her husband had hidden it either, that he had died before he could tell her, and that for all those years she had lived in terror, that Orlowski would someday find it, or worse, that he would become convinced she and her daughter possessed it. She held Bernice's hand tightly, her eyes pleading, and said she had kept the secret to protect her, so her daughter could live a normal life without carrying the deadly curse of her father upon her shoulders. But now, with the men searching the apartment again, and death drawing closer to both of them, she could no longer remain silent. Bernice wrapped her arms around her mother, trembling, and only one thought echoed through her mind like a funeral bell, that she and her mother were sitting on a bomb whose fuse had been lit long ago in the past, and that the man who had saved them, Darius Halewood, might be standing far closer to the center of it all than she could ever have imagined. In the days following her mother's confession, Bernice lived in a state of inner conflict, unlike anything she had ever known. She looked at Darius through different eyes, and every time she stood near him at the halcyon, a question clawed at her from within. Did this man know about her father, about the evidence, about the connection between her and the man who had murdered him? Was all the kindness he had shown her, the job, her mother's medical bills, the quiet protection, nothing more than a carefully calculated move to draw her within reach, to use her as a piece in the game between him and Orlowski, the man she had only just learned was his sworn enemy? The thought chilled her, because if it were true, then the fragile feeling beginning to bloom inside her was only an illusion, and once again, she was nothing more than a pawn in the hands of powerful men. But then she remembered the night beside the piano, remembered how his voice had broken when he spoke Colette's name, remembered the naked loneliness in those gray eyes, something no actor could ever imitate, and her heart swung violently in the opposite direction. She hated her own helplessness, hated that she couldn't draw a clear line between gratitude and affection, between caution and the longing to trust someone after so many years of carrying everything alone. She told herself she mustn't fall in love with this man, that his world was filled with blood and darkness, that if she allowed her heart to soften even slightly, she could lose everything, including her mother. And yet every night, she found herself waiting for the moment he entered the room, hoping his gaze would linger on her for more than a second, and she despised herself for that weakness. For Darius, the battle within was even more violent, though he concealed it behind a flawless mask of cold control. He had begun to feel something he believed had died with Colette, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever could, because he knew the price of allowing a woman into his heart. He had loved once, and the woman he loved had paid with both her life and the life of their unborn child, swallowed by the violent world he had chosen. He had sworn over their grave that he would never let it happen again, that he would never allow his heart to become a weakness his enemies could exploit. Yet now Bernice was there, inside his empire, beneath his protection, and with every passing day, the invisible bond between them tightened. He knew he should push her away, sever every connection, and return her to a safe life far beyond the deadly reach of his world. But he couldn't do it, and that helplessness made the most powerful man in Baltimore feel weak for the first time in many years. One night, when the two of them happened to be alone in the private room, the distance between them narrowed to something dangerous. Bernice had come to ask him about an issue in the accounts, but the conversation drifted in another direction, something more personal, and beneath the warm light, they suddenly realized they were standing far too close. Darius looked down at her face and saw in her eyes the same struggle burning inside him, and for one moment he almost surrendered, almost allowed himself to touch her. But then the image of Colette lying in a pool of blood returned without warning, and he stepped back, turned his face away, and told Bernice in a dry voice to go home and rest. She stood there, hurt and confused, unable to understand why he had pushed her away at the very moment she had felt closest to him. She didn't know it was because he was afraid that if he allowed her any nearer, he would no longer have the strength to protect her from the world he carried with him. That night, they both lay awake in different corners of the city, sharing the same inner torment, the same restrained longing, and the same fear that whatever was growing between them would become the beginning of a tragedy neither of them would be strong enough to stop. The turmoil forced Bernice to make a decision, and after many sleepless nights, she chose the only path her honest nature would allow, to face the truth instead of running from it. She went to Darius late one evening, and this time it wasn't to ask about the accounts or avoid his gaze, but to tell him everything directly. She told him what her mother had confessed, about her father the accountant, about how he had once laundered money for Orlowski, about the evidence he had gathered and taken with him when he tried to flee, and about his death many years ago, a death that hadn't been an accident. Her voice trembled, but it remained steady as she said she needed the truth, that she needed him to tell her whether everything he had done for her was because she possessed something he wanted. Darius listened, and when she finished, his face changed in a way that left Bernice stunned, because it wasn't the reaction of a man who had known all along. but of someone who had just been struck by lightning. He rose, paced across the room, and when he turned back, a fierce light burned in his gray eyes unlike anything she had ever seen. He told her what he himself had only just pieced together, and his words seemed to freeze the entire room. He said the evidence her father had left behind wouldn't merely be enough to destroy Orlowski in a court of law, though that alone would make it a weapon coveted by the entire underworld. He said that if everything her mother had told her was true, if those files really contained every transaction and every crime Orlowski had committed throughout his career, then they might also hold the answer to the question that had haunted him for the past 4 years. Bernice didn't understand, and Darius, his voice thick and rough, revealed for the first time something he had never shared with anyone. He said that Colette's death had never truly been solved. People claimed it had been an attack meant for him, and that she had simply been caught in it, but in 4 years, he had never discovered who had ordered it, never found the evidence he needed to take revenge, and that helplessness had eaten away at him every day. He had always suspected Orlowski, because their war over territory had been at its peak at the time, but he had never been able to prove it. And now, if the files Bernice's father had created truly recorded every crime Orlowski had committed, then there might also be a trace within them of the person who had ordered the deaths of his wife and unborn child. Bernice looked at him, and suddenly she understood the horrifying truth of her own position. She, a poor waitress who had believed herself to be invisible, had somehow come to hold the key to the fate of 2 empires at once. To Orlowski, the files were a death sentence he had to destroy at any cost, the reason he had hunted her family without rest for so long. To Darius, they were a weapon that could both destroy his lifelong enemy and bring justice to his dead wife, the very thing he had searched for in despair for 4 years without ever knowing it might be within reach. And caught between those 2 immense forces were Bernice and her sick mother, 2 vulnerable people, holding a bomb both sides desperately wanted, even though neither of them knew where it was. That was the cruelest problem of all. Bernice admitted that her mother didn't know where her father had hidden the files, that he had died before he could reveal the location, and that for all those years, they had remained somewhere in silence, a buried secret neither the hunters nor the hunted had been able to find. Darius remained quiet for a long time, and inside him, 4 years of bottled rage and a desperate hunger for justice flared to life, tangled with a new and unfamiliar fear. Because now he understood that as long as the files remained missing, Bernice and her mother would continue to be targets, and Orlowski would never stop. He looked at her, the woman who had stumbled into his life, carrying both the answer to his painful past and a deadly threat, and he knew the game had entered a new stage, one in which every piece had been placed on the board except the most important one, the thing he and Bernice now had to find before the enemy did. Darius immediately ordered Fen to investigate the men who had been watching the Wade family more deeply, and the first thing Fen uncovered caused a seemingly meaningless fragment from the past to suddenly come into sharp focus. He reminded Darius of the name Vernon Kish, the nightclub manager who had fired Bernice on that very fateful morning, the man who had thrown her into the street, where she had collided with him. From the beginning, Darius had sensed something unusual about the man, because firing an employee simply for refusing to serve one important guest privately was far too minor a matter for a manager to handle personally in the middle of the day. But at the time, he hadn't paid much attention. Now Fen brought him the chilling truth. Vernon Kish wasn't merely an insignificant nightclub manager. He worked for Orlowski and had been planted inside that club years earlier with one purpose: to watch Bernice Wade. Orlowski had never allowed the Wade family to leave his sight, and he had placed Kish beside the daughter, tracking her every movement throughout the entire time she worked there, waiting for the day she might accidentally reveal some clue about the files her father had left behind. Firing her hadn't been an impulsive decision, but a calculated, predatory play. Orlowski's patience was wearing thin, and Kish had fired her to choke off her only source of income, pushing her into absolute desperation. They calculated that, cornered by her mother's medical bills, Bernice would have no choice but to dig up and sell whatever hidden assets or family relics her father had left behind, leading them straight to the treasure. They never anticipated that Darius Halewood would step in and shield her so quickly. Darius ground his teeth as he realized that from the very first moment, Bernice had collided with him. She had already been under surveillance, and that Orlovsky's hand had reached into her life long before he appeared. But that realization came too late. That very night, while Darius and Fen were still piecing everything together, a phone call tore the world apart. Bernice called him, her voice so panicked she could barely form the words, and what she said made the blood in his veins turn cold. She had returned to the apartment and found the door standing wide open, her mother gone, the dialysis machine ripped from its outlet and lying on the floor. And on the bed where Beatrix had been resting, there was only a note. Darius rushed to East Baltimore as quickly as he could, and when he entered that miserable room, he found Bernice collapsed on her knees in the middle of the floor, her trembling hand clutching the paper, her face drained of every trace of color. The message was brief and merciless. The kidnappers said they had Beatrix, that a sick woman who depended on dialysis wouldn't survive long without the machine, and that if Bernice wanted to see her mother alive again, she had 2 days to surrender the files her father had hidden. No police, no Darius Halewood, and no one else was to become involved, or her mother would die. At the bottom of the note, like a cold mockery, was a line reminding her that they knew every move she made, that they had been watching her far longer than she realized, followed by a detail only one person could have known, the joke Vernon Kish had made to her during her final shift before firing her. Bernice stared at those words and understood, her entire body collapsing beneath the weight of the betrayal. The manager she had once believed was nothing more than an ordinary cruel man, the one who had driven her to the edge of ruin, had actually been Orlovsky's eyes watching her for years, and now he was the one who had taken her sick mother. She explained through her tears that she had just brought her mother back from her scheduled hospital treatment to rest, only for Orlovsky's men to breach the apartment while she was briefly away. She looked up at Darius, her eyes filled with tears yet burning with fierce desperation, and said she didn't have the files, that she didn't even know where they were, that she couldn't surrender something she herself couldn't find, and that if they failed to locate them within 2 days, her mother would die. Darius stood in the middle of that room as rage and helplessness surged through his chest, because the sight of a woman he cared about crumbling in despair, after his violent world had taken someone she loved, struck the deepest wound he had spent 4 years trying to bury. And this time, he swore to himself, history wouldn't repeat itself. Orlovsky was a master of manipulation, and he knew that the fastest way to destroy a man wasn't with knives or guns, but by planting doubt inside his own heart. The very next day, while Darius was pouring every resource he had into mobilizing his men to search for Beatrix, an envelope reached him through a channel he knew, with certainty belonged to Orlovsky's side. Inside were documents forged with a precision so convincing it was deadly, photographs showing Bernice meeting with Orlovsky's men at different times, recordings of her voice cut and pieced together, and a falsified contract claiming that Orlovsky had paid her from the beginning to approach Darius Halewood, infiltrate his empire, extract information, and turn him into prey. Everything had been arranged to tell a perfect and vicious story, that their fateful encounter outside the nightclub had never been an accident, that the 5 words she had whispered against his chest had only been the opening act of a trap, that the woman he had allowed into his sealed heart was actually a spy planted there to destroy him. Darius stared at the documents, and an icy chill spread through his entire body. His reason told him this could be an attempt to divide them, that Orlovsky was entirely capable of fabricating every piece of evidence, but the old wound inside him, the obsession that trust and love had once caused him to lose everything, had been reopened with merciless accuracy. In the darkest moment of doubt, he remembered every coincidence, the way Bernice had appeared at exactly the right time, the way her father tied her to Orlovsky, the way she had entered his life carrying an entire conspiracy that had drawn him in before he even realized it. And fear, the fear that had ruled him for 4 years, won. When Bernice came to him desperate and pleading for his help to save her mother, Darius did something he would regret to the very end. He pushed her away. He looked at her with gray eyes cold as ice, a gaze that had sealed itself completely shut, and in the merciless voice of the man all Baltimore feared, he told her he knew who she was, that he knew she worked for Orlovsky, that her performance was over. He threw the forged documents onto the table in front of her, and said he had been a fool to trust a poor waitress, that he wouldn't allow himself to be deceived again. Bernice looked at the photographs and the false papers, and she understood that she had been framed, but what hurt her most wasn't Orlowski's slander. It was the fact that Darius, the man who had heard her voice break when she spoke about her mother, the man who had shared his grief with her beside the piano, could believe any of it. She didn't fall to her knees and beg, and she didn't scream or weep as she tried to defend herself. Just as she had on that first morning, she straightened her back, gathered the last fragments of dignity she still possessed, and looked directly into his eyes. She said quietly that she had never asked him for anything, that she had tried to refuse his kindness from the beginning, because she knew that anything given freely always carried a price, and that if he truly believed she was a liar after everything they had endured together, then perhaps he had never truly seen her at all. Then she turned away and walked out, exactly as she had walked away on the day they first met, without looking back, without waiting, leaving him alone in the empty room with the forged evidence in a silence so heavy it was difficult to breathe. That night, Bernice sat alone in the hollow apartment where her mother had once lain and faced the cold truth that she had no one left. No Darius, no one at all, only herself and 2 brief days to save the dying mother held in her enemy's hands. She dried her tears, and in her eyes, despair slowly hardened into iron determination. If no one would help her, then she would do it herself. She would find the files her father had left behind, no matter how deeply they were buried in the past, and she would take her mother back with those same calloused hands, even if it cost her everything, and Darius, standing in the cold penthouse above the city, stared down into the darkness and felt an emptiness worse than all the loneliness of the previous 4 years, the emptiness of a man who had just driven away the last good thing remaining in his life. Fen wasn't a man easily deceived, and while Darius sank into the darkness of suspicion, he quietly did what his employer should have done before speaking those cruel words. He took the forged documents away, and with the meticulous eye of someone who had learned to analyze every tiny detail in order to survive, he began taking them apart. Within a single night, the cracks in Orlowski's performance began to show. The photographs that appeared to show Bernice meeting with Orlowski's men had been altered. The light and shadows across her face didn't match the background, clear signs that the images had been pieced together. When Fen had the recording of her voice examined closely, it revealed clumsy cuts, words stitched together from several different conversations, and the forged contract bearing her signature contained one detail the fabricator couldn't possibly have known: the date she had supposedly begun working at the old nightclub, a time when the real records showed she hadn't even set foot in Baltimore. But the most important thing Fen discovered wasn't hidden inside the false evidence. It was in the source from which it had come. By tracing the route through which the envelope had been delivered, he discovered that Vernon Kish himself had served as the intermediary, the man planted beside Bernice for a long time now revealed as the one who had orchestrated the entire frame-up. And, bitterly enough, Kish's involvement in creating the false evidence became the strongest proof of Bernice's innocence, because if she truly had been Orlowski's spy, there would have been no need to invent evidence proving it. Such evidence only needed to be manufactured when someone wanted an innocent woman to appear guilty in Darius's eyes. Fen brought every discovery to Darius at dawn, and he didn't hide the disappointment in his voice. He laid everything on the table, pointed out each detail one by one, and when he finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Darius stared at the proof of her innocence, and it felt as though all the strength had been drained from his body. He understood what he had done. He had allowed Orlowski to play the exact card he wanted, allowed old fear to control him, and in that moment of panic, he had driven away the only woman in 4 years who had dared look him in the eyes and speak the truth, at the very moment she needed him most. But what tormented him most wasn't that he had been deceived. It was the realization that he had repeated the very mistake that had destroyed his life. 4 years earlier, he had failed to protect Colette because he had underestimated the cruelty of his enemy, and now, when fate had offered him a second chance to protect someone he cared about, he had pushed her into danger with his own hands, not because the enemy was stronger than he was, but because of the cowardice inside his own heart, because he had chosen suspicion over trust, chosen self-protection over standing beside her. Darius refused to comfort himself with the thought that the deception had been skillfully created. He knew that a man who truly trusted Bernice would never have believed those papers, no matter how convincing the forgery had been, and the truth was that when the moment came, he hadn't trusted her enough. The regret weighed on him so heavily that he could barely breathe, but he wouldn't allow himself to collapse beneath it, because he knew Bernice was out there alone, racing against time to save her mother, and every second he wasted on remorse brought her 1 second closer to death. He rose, and when he turned toward Fen, his gray eyes no longer held the frozen emptiness of a man closing himself off, but the cold fire of iron determination. He said he had been wrong, that he had made an unforgivable mistake, but he wouldn't allow it to become the last mistake he ever made. He would find Bernice, he would take Beatrix back from Orlowski, and this time he wouldn't let fear or any scheme of his enemy separate him from what was right. He ordered Fen to mobilize every man they had, and as dawn began to break over the city, the man who had buried his heart 4 years earlier stepped out of his own darkness, carrying not only a desperate need for redemption, but also a fury reserved for the enemy, who had used his deepest wound to destroy the last good thing he still possessed. Darius found Bernice before daylight had fully broken, inside the empty apartment where she was tearing through every corner with trembling hands and eyes darkened by a sleepless night. When he entered, she looked up, and for the first moment, her gaze was filled with suspicion and pain, because this was the man who had only just driven her away with the cruelest words he could have spoken. But Darius didn't make excuses, and he didn't offer cheap apologies. He placed every piece of evidence Fen had uncovered on the table, exposing Orlowski's entire deception and Vernon Kish's role in it, then looked directly into her eyes and admitted that he had been wrong, that he had allowed his own fear to turn him into a fool, and that he didn't expect her to forgive him now. He asked only one thing of her, that she give him the chance to help save her mother. Bernice studied him for a long time, and though the wound inside her hadn't healed, she understood that she couldn't fight Orlowski's entire empire alone, and that the man standing before her, despite the pain he had caused, was Beatrix's only hope of surviving. She nodded, not because she had forgiven him, but because her mother mattered more than her pride, and so the two of them, together with Fig, and racing against time. They had less than 2 days remaining. Fen spread out a plan that he and Darius had developed throughout the night, and the first and most important task was finding the files. Without them, they had nothing to bargain with against Orlowski, and no weapon capable of bringing him down. Darius made it clear that he had no intention of trading Beatrix's life for the files in the manner Orlowski demanded, because surrendering them would mean placing in his hands something powerful enough to destroy both Darius and Bernice, and a man like Orlowski would never leave witnesses alive once he possessed what he needed. Darius's plan was different, and it depended on a weapon Orlowski would never expect, the law. Darius revealed that he had connections with several people in law enforcement, people who had waited for years to obtain enough evidence to bring Orlowski down, but had never managed to reach him. If the files Bernice's father had created truly contained proof of all his crimes, then they weren't merely a bargaining piece to save Beatrix. They could also send Orlowski to prison for the rest of his life through legal means, ending everything without the need for a bloodbath. But it all depended on finding them. Bernice said desperately that she had searched the entire apartment, that her mother didn't know where her father had hidden them, and that even Orlowski, with all his resources, hadn't found them after all this time. Darius told her to calm herself and think about her father, about the kind of man he had been, about where someone like him would have chosen to hide the most valuable thing he possessed. He asked whether anything from the time her father was alive had remained with the family through all those years, through every move and every period of hardship, something that no matter how poor they became, Bernice and her mother had never been willing to sell. Bernice went still, and a distant memory suddenly came alive inside her mind. She said her voice strengthened that there was one thing, the piano. She explained that her father had once played, that the old piano was the only possession of his, that her mother had insisted on keeping for all those years, even during times when they had been so hungry they had nearly sold it, and that Beatrix had always said it was all she had left of her husband. But then Bernice's face darkened as she remembered that, driven by desperation, her mother had finally been forced to sell it several years earlier to pay for medicine. To protect her father's memory from Orlowski, Beatrix had pawned it under a false name at a crumbling, unregistered shop on the outskirts of the city, and she had no idea where it was now. Darius realized that the shop's recent bankruptcy must have caused its inventory to be sold off to high-end restorers, which was how the piano finally resurfaced in the elite market. Darius and Fen exchanged a glance as the same thought flashed through both their minds. If Bernice's father had hidden the files inside the piano, and if the instrument had been sold, then finding it had become a race between life and death, because if Orlowski discovered the same clue, he would reach it first. Darius immediately ordered Fen to trace the piano through every pawnshop and auction house in the city, and what Fen uncovered left all three of them silent. After passing through the hands of several owners, the old piano had finally been entered into an extravagant charity auction, scheduled to take place in only 2 days, a major event that would bring together both the city's elite and its most powerful figures. Darius looked at the invitation to the event, where his name was already included on the guest list, and in his gray eyes a plan began to take shape, one he hadn't yet revealed completely, but enough for him to know that the night of the auction would be the place where every final piece was placed upon the board. 2 days later, the charity auction took place in a magnificent mansion overlooking the bay, where crystal chandeliers illuminated a sea of guests dressed in expensive formal wear, where wine flowed like water and polite smiles concealed countless calculations. It was where Baltimore's elite displayed their wealth in the name of charity, but it was also where the most powerful figures of the underworld blended into the crowd, and tonight, both rival empires were present. Darius entered with Bernice on his arm, and their appearance caused the entire grand hall to pause for a brief moment. He had chosen a deep blue evening gown for her, and dressed in it, the waitress who had once staggered from hunger now stood tall, with a beauty and dignity that made the wealthy guests whisper among themselves, wondering who the woman beside the most powerful crime lord in the city could be. Darius made no effort to hide her, didn't bring her through a back entrance as though she were some shameful secret, but openly led her through the crowd, introduced her to influential figures, and placed her within his world before everyone's eyes, a silent declaration that anyone who touched her would be touching him. But beneath that glittering surface, Bernice's heart pounded violently, because she knew her mother was being held somewhere at this mansion, and the old piano, the object carrying the fate of them all, was waiting to be brought onto the auction floor. Thaddeus Orlowski was there as well, sitting comfortably in one corner of the hall with a glass of wine in his hand, and the cold smile of a man who believed he held every card. When his gaze met Darius's, both men understood that tonight would decide everything, and that their confrontation wouldn't unfold with gunfire among this crowd of wealthy guests, but through intelligence and moves calculated down to the smallest detail. When the auctioneer announced the next item, the antique piano, Bernice held her breath and saw Orlowski's men begin bidding, determined to claim the instrument at any cost. But Darius was already one step ahead. He didn't join the bidding, because he knew Orlowski would drive the price endlessly higher, and an open battle over money would only make him suspicious. Instead, while every eye was fixed on the auction floor, Fen and several of Darius's men moved quietly behind the scenes, reaching the piano before it was brought out, and inside a hidden lining beneath the bottom of its case. In a place no one had thought to search since it was hidden, they found it. A bundle of documents carefully wrapped and yellowed with age, the very files Bernice's father had hidden at the cost of his life. When Fen discreetly signaled that he had secured them, Darius began the real game. He walked toward Orlowski, and amid the flowing music and shallow conversation surrounding them, the two lifelong enemies faced one another. In a voice low enough that no one else could hear but sharp enough to cut skin, Darius told Orlowski that the files were now in his hands, that every crime he had committed throughout the years, every transaction, every name, every piece of evidence, had all been copied and sent to secure locations with instructions for their release if anything happened to him. The smile on Orlowski's lips froze. Darius continued, telling him he had 2 choices. He could release Beatrix Wade immediately, unharmed and safe, then wait for whatever the law had in store for him, or Darius would destroy him that very night, not with knives or guns among this crowd, but with evidence powerful enough to collapse his entire empire and send him to prison for the rest of his life. Orlowski looked around and realized that Darius's men had quietly surrounded every exit, realized that the piano and the secret hidden inside it had slipped beyond his reach. And for the first time that night, the cold confidence of the man who believed he controlled every card began to crack. But a man like Orlowski didn't surrender easily, and in his eyes Darius saw the reckless desperation of an animal driven into a corner, the most dangerous thing of all, and he knew that the hardest part of the night, rescuing Beatrix from his grasp, still lay ahead, driven into a corner. Orlowski played his final card, whispering that if Darius didn't allow him to leave, the men guarding Beatrix would receive an order, and she would never see daylight again. But Darius had anticipated that move, and he replied quietly that while Orlowski was still busy believing he remained in control, Fen had followed the very men he had sent and discovered where she was being held. The truth was that while the confrontation unfolded in the main hall, Fen had led a tactical team to a secure, abandoned warehouse near the docks, the exact location his scouts had kidnappers to. There, Vernon Kish, the traitor standing guard over Beatrix, was subdued before he could do any harm, and the frail woman was secured safely. The struggle was swift and bloodless, because Darius's men had overwhelming numbers and the advantage of surprise. Kish was knocked down and restrained, while Beatrix, frail but still alive, was carried out in the arms of the men who had come to save her. When Bernice saw her mother being helped forward, she ran to her, fell to her knees, and wrapped her arms around her as the tears she had held back for so many days finally burst free. Beatrix trembled as she stroked her daughter's hair and whispered that she was all right, and in that moment, amid the chaos of the auction night, mother and daughter clung to each other as though they were the only two people left in the world. Orlowski, watching his last card crumble to nothing, was quietly escorted outside by Darius's men, where the people Darius had arranged in advance were already waiting. But the story didn't end there, because when Fen opened the yellowed files to examine them in a quiet room, he found something that left even him stunned, and he immediately carried it to Darius. Among the hundreds of pages documenting Orlowski's crimes across his entire past was a separate file, carefully recorded by Bernice's father, concerning an incident that had taken place 4 years earlier. Darius held those pages in his hands, and as his eyes moved across each line, the entire world around him seemed to collapse and then rebuild itself in a completely different form. The documents made it clear that the attack that had taken Colette and their unborn child 4 years earlier had never been a random tragedy in the territorial war, as Darius had always believed. It had been an assassination meticulously planned by Orlowski, but the true objective hadn't been to kill Darius. His enemy had been clever enough to know that murdering Darius would only ignite an all-out war, so instead he had chosen a far more vicious blow, killing the woman Darius loved and arranging everything, so Darius would believe that he himself, and the violent world he had chosen, had indirectly caused her death. Orlowski understood that a Darius crushed beneath guilt, a Darius imprisoned within remorse and loneliness, would become far weaker and more directionless than a Darius with a clearly defined enemy to destroy. And he had been right. For 4 years, Darius had blamed himself for a crime he had never committed, buried his heart beneath guilt deliberately planted by his enemy, and lived like a soulless corpse because he believed he no longer deserved to feel anything. Now, holding the truth in his hands, Darius stood in silence, and something inside his chest, something frozen for 4 long years, finally broke apart. Tears which he had believed had dried up long ago slipped quietly down the face of the man the entire city feared. He wept, not only from the pain of discovering that his wife and child had been deliberately murdered, but from the profound release of finally understanding that he hadn't killed them, that the guilt crushing him for all those years had never belonged to him. Bernice, approaching him after leaving her mother's side, saw him in the most vulnerable and honest moment of his life, and she understood everything without needing an explanation. She stepped beside him, and this time there was no distance, no fear, and no defensive walls between them. She simply placed her hand over his, sharing both his grief and his release, 2 wounded souls who had once believed they would never heal now standing together beneath the crystal light, finally free from the ghosts that had imprisoned them for far too long. In the weeks following the night of the auction, the city of Baltimore witnessed a collapse that the underworld would continue talking about for years. The files Bernice's father had sacrificed his life to protect, preserved through all their hardships inside the old piano, were finally delivered to the federal agents Darius had connections with, men and women who had waited a long time for an opportunity like this. The evidence was so detailed that it couldn't be denied, recording every stream of dirty money, every payment, every name within the criminal network Thaddeus Orlowski had built over the course of his criminal life, including proof of Colette's assassination. The Federal Bureau of Investigation moved in with its full force, and one morning, Orlowski was arrested at his private residence and led away in handcuffs before the cameras of the press, while the empire he had built on blood and fear collapsed within only a few hours. He would face a series of charges severe enough to keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, and this time, no amount of money or influence could save him. Vernon Kish, the man who had betrayed Bernice and helped carry out Beatrix's kidnapping, was also turned over to the authorities along with evidence proving his role. And the man who had once believed himself clever for serving someone more powerful finally paid for what he had done, facing justice instead of hiding in the shadows. Darius had chosen the path of law rather than violent revenge, and it was a change even he hadn't expected from himself, because in the past, he would have settled everything according to the brutal rules of the underworld. But the night he learned the truth about Colette had changed something deep inside him. He understood that the endless cycle of violence and vengeance only created more violence, that the very world he had chosen had taken everything from him, and that if he wanted a future, if he wanted to be worthy of the woman who had given him back his heart, he had to step out of that darkness. And so Darius began a journey more difficult than any war he had ever fought, dismantling the criminal empire he himself had built. He couldn't erase the past, but he could change the future. He transformed his operations into entirely legitimate enterprises, turning the clubs, real estate holdings, and investments that had once served the underworld into transparent and lawful businesses. He severed old connections, surrendered the dark power he had once possessed, and although the road was filled with hardship, and more than a few former enemies tried to stand in his way, he continued forward with unwavering determination, because for the first time in many years, he had a reason to move toward the light. At the same time, he used his immense and legitimate resources to ensure that Beatrix received the finest medical care available. With Dr. Margot Price's assistance, she underwent a thorough evaluation and was placed on the National Kidney Transplant waiting list through the proper process, receiving priority based on the true severity of her medical condition rather than through any illegal interference. Darius understood clearly that there were boundaries he couldn't cross, that some things money mustn't be allowed to buy, that a donated kidney had to reach a patient through a fair and humane process, and he respected that completely. What he could do, and what he did, was make certain Beatrix remained stable and alive while she waited, received dialysis on the most advanced equipment available, lived in a decent environment instead of the damp apartment in East Baltimore, and was cared for by the best doctors. Bernice witnessed all those changes, and although the wound from the night he had pushed her away still ached quietly inside her, she saw before her a man sincerely struggling to become better, not merely to make amends to her, but because he had finally begun to believe he deserved a different life. She realized that people weren't defined by who they had once been, but by who they chose to become, and the man whose name had once been spoken throughout Baltimore with fear was now quietly rewriting his own story, one day at a time, through acts of kindness. Many months had passed since that fateful night, and on a spring evening, the lights of the Halcyon shone once again, though the atmosphere had changed beyond recognition. There were no more secret meetings behind closed doors, no more envelopes exchanged in the shadows, and none of the dark power that had once hung over the place. Now the Halcyon was simply a jazz club, a place where people came to listen to music and find a little peace, and in the familiar corner of the stage, beside the glossy black piano, Bernice sat playing. Her hands, now softened from the calluses of those desperate years, moved across the keys with a freedom she had lost long ago. She played that old piece, the melody that had connected two wounded souls on an unforgettable night, but this time it no longer carried the sorrow of loss. Instead, it rose like a song of hope and new beginnings. Beatrix sat at a table near the stage, a faint warmth of life restored to her face, her eyes following her daughter with the happiness of a mother who had finally lived long enough to see her child safe. At the far end of the room, Darius entered, but this time he didn't stop in the darkest corner, as he once had, and he didn't imprison himself in the shadows of loneliness. He walked directly toward her, and when Bernice looked up and met his eyes, she smiled, a smile with no defenses left within it. He came to the piano, and in that moment, they both remembered the first morning in the mist, when a starving young woman had whispered 5 words against the chest of a man made of ice, and had been coldly pushed away. Now that man didn't push her away. He bent down, took her hands in his, the hands that had once lifted a glass of water to her mother's lips in a miserable room, the hands that had divided the final piece of bread, and he spoke words that completely reversed the 5 words that had begun everything. He told her that from that day forward, no one in this family would ever go hungry again, that he would be there, not to grant charity or offer pity, but to build a life beside her, where both she and her mother could live with dignity and peace. It wasn't an act of charity, but a promise, the promise of a man who had learned that the most precious thing in the world wasn't power or wealth, but the gift of loving and cherishing another person exactly as they were. Bernice looked at him, tears of happiness shining in her eyes, because she understood that the journey that had begun with a desperate sentence, spoken through hunger and bitter cold, had now led her to a place she had never dared dream of. Not wealth, though that was present too, but a home, a love, and above all, dignity finally honored. Beneath all the drama of the underworld and its dark conspiracies, the story of Bernice and Darius was truly a story about the value of a human life. It reminds us that dignity doesn't come from status or wealth, that a poor and starving waitress can still carry a nobility powerful enough to make the most influential man bow his head, and that sometimes, choosing to respect a person at the lowest moment of their life is the most honorable act we can ever perform. It also reminds us that compassion has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, that no one must be defined forever by their past or their pain, and that there is always a path out of the darkness when we are brave enough to choose the light. In real life, so many people around us are silently carrying burdens we know nothing about. So many people serve us every day, with smiles that conceal their private struggles. And perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is that we should treat everyone with kindness and respect, because we can never know how one small act of ours might change an entire life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so that together we can spread meaningful stories and listen to more captivating tales every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, what you think of Bernice and Darius's journey, and what it has made you reflect upon in the life around you. Please leave a comment so we can hear the deepest emotions from your heart, because every thought you share is a precious source of encouragement that allows us to continue bringing you stories that touch the soul. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment, and we wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, joy in each day of life, and peace within the soul. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos.